3 introductory comments. Comment number 1. Since October 7th, all of us have been focused deeply into Israel. What's going on in Israel, what's going on in Gaza, what's going on around the world in relation to Israel, what's happened here in America in relation to Israel. So I could think of nothing else to really talk about. I think we need to talk about this. What I'd like to do, however, is I'd like to talk about how Israel is going to change, how October 7th has changed Israel, how October 7th has changed us and our relationship to Israel. I have a thesis I'd like to advance today, but I'm really interested in that change. And that's what we're going to be looking at together. Introductory comment number 2. I typically live in the world of Jewish ideas. It's how I grew up. It's how I was trained by Rabbi Schulweis. And so typically I bring philosophical texts and political texts, and we would talk about great Jewish ideas. And we will do a lot of that. However, when you talk about how people change, and my teacher of change, Sally Weber, is here, so she can validate this. When you talk about how people change, it's not just a matter of the head, it's also a matter of the heart. Israel today, if you have relatives or friends there, family members, people that are there, is feeling something it hasn't felt ever. It's feeling something it hasn't felt, at least in a very, very long time. So we have to deal with the head and the heart at the same time, with ideas and feelings. And for that, we need a different kind of text. Philosophical, political texts can account for the ideas that govern life. But if we want to reflect on the emotions, we have to look at, well, music, poetry, literature, film, TV, theater, all sorts of other ways that the human heart expresses itself. So this course is going to be, your class, this discussion is going to be a combination of head and heart, a combination of philosophical, political ideas, as well as some deep reflections on how people are feeling, okay? I don't know if we're going to get into the really deep geopolitics of October 7th. That's sort of not what I'm interested in right now. I'm really interested in October 8th. How does a society absorb that kind of catastrophe and then turn and say yes to life? Where do you find that resilience? On what basis does one make that judgment? And for those who can't make that judgment, what are they going to do? And then what happens to us? That's what we're going to be looking at together. So you'll see today there's both philosophical, religious, and political texts, and then some song lyrics that I think are very revealing. Our next couple of sessions, in addition to this one, after this one of our sessions is going to be with the Israeli scholar Rachel Korazim, who, for my money, is the best scholar of Israeli literature in the world. And she's certainly been my teacher for Israeli literature. And she's going to do an evening with us from Israel. We'll do it on a giant Zoom screen. But you can't watch it at home. You got to come here and watch it. And she's going to do an evening with us on the new poetry that's being written in Israel. So we can hear the voice of Israelis processing the trauma, the catastrophe, and the recovery process. That's what we're going to hear from Rachel. We're going to have a session with my dear friend Donnie Mossing. Donnie is a very, very gifted Israeli musician. He's lived here for a number of years. His English is very good. He has a really interesting historical background, which we'll talk about. And Donnie's going to talk about the music of Israel right now, okay? And how the music reflects changes in attitude that have led to this moment and moving forward. And then we'll talk a little bit about the politics and what's going on within the heart of Israeli society. That's going to be our conversation together. Fair enough? Good. That was the second introductory. Here's the third introductory comment, right? You can't talk about this without deep emotions. Many of us bring very deep emotions to this topic. Okay, I teach a lot of things here at VBS. I teach Parshat HaShavua, the weekly Torah portion. I've been teaching the prayer book on Saturday mornings, on the second and fourth Saturday mornings of every month at 9 o'clock, right where you're sitting. Not that I would invite. I teach a lot of stuff, and I can get away with a lot of ideas. But when you talk about Israel, people get excited. They get crazed. They get emotional. Okay, so let's just put something out on the table. It's a sort of request and a sort of condition. You're going to hear ideas you say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. I agree with that. And you're going to hear ideas where you say, oh, no, that's wrong. And you're even going to hear ideas where you say, that's dangerous. Good. Hearing ideas that you didn't walk in with is what we call education. That's the whole idea. If you already knew that, you didn't need to come. You could have stayed home, dry, warm, and watched CNN, right? If you want just stuff you already agree with, you don't need to learn anything. Learning something means stepping out of your comfort zone into a place where you're thinking things that you hadn't thought before. We're going to do that together. Now, you don't have to agree with anything. You can ask questions, you can challenge, you can criticize, you can interrogate. That's how we learn. But the one thing we can't do is become disagreeable with each other. We can disagree without being disagreeable. Okay? I promise you I love Israel. I don't know how to demonstrate any more than I've already demonstrated over 35 years working here in the shul. I go there every summer. I speak Hebrew. I read Israeli newspapers. My brother lives in Herzliya, right? I have kids that I've raised in the shul that are fighting in the IDF now. I love this country. I'm critical. Lots of things in Israel I'm really upset about. I don't know an Israeli who isn't. I don't know one Israeli who walks the earth saying everything is fine. Hakol beseder. They don't say that. They'll say hakol beseder, chutz mizeh, except for, and then they'll tell you the long laundry list of things there are, and we can argue about this stuff. Okay? There are words. It's gotten so distraught, so fraught, that's the word, that even words, right? If I use the West Bank to describe that territory between the Jordan River and Tel Aviv, don't get angry and say, no, Yehuda and Vishomron. You can say that, but don't get upset. If I say territories, that's because in Hebrew the word is shtachim, and that's the word that they use, and territories, the general translation for it. Again, or I can say Yehuda and Shomron, if we talk about settlements, if we talk about the government. We can disagree without being ugly to each other. And right now, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you know this, but there are only 14 million Jews in the world, right? And about 3/4 to half of them really love Israel. So that makes about 7 million, 8 million people who really love Israel, right? Not all of them live in Israel. They live all over the place. So we can't afford to push each other out of the room. We really sort of need each other, okay? So let's try to have this conversation in a civil, respectful, and family way. Fair enough? Good, okay. All right, if I want an applause, I will ask you for it. I'm really good at that. Okay, and the first thing I'm going to tell you is it's warm in here again. I haven't been warm in this synagogue since 19... Okay. Here's my thesis tonight. Ready? October 7th was a catastrophe unprecedented in the history of Israel. What's so interesting, however, is that from October 7th to now, something remarkable has happened in Israel and to those of us who love Israel. From October 7th to now, we have reiterated, replayed, relived the entire historical drama of Zionism. That is, on October 7th, we tasted the condition, particularly of Europe, but other places as well, the condition that the Jewish tradition always called galut, exile, with its helplessness and its homelessness and its placelessness and its powerlessness. October 7th, the reason why October 7th was such an unprecedented catastrophe, I mean, aside from 1,200 people being killed and the horrifying rape and the murder and the celebration of the thing, the reason why it touched us more than it would have touched any other people, I mean, God forbid this happens anyplace else, but it touched us because we remember that. Because that was the condition of life that Zionism, the creation of the State of Israel, the return to a homeland, was supposed to heal. And we all, even though it's been generations, carry within us a collective memory of what that was like. I have never been in a pogrom. My grandfather was in a pogrom. He told me about the pogrom, but I was never in the pogrom. But I carry his memories with me. I just carry them in my genetics. And when we witnessed October 7th, for a moment, I was him. A frightened child in a small village in Poland, hiding under his bed, hoping the Cossacks don't find him. And that's what made this crazy making. That's the first thing. So we have to go back now and understand exile so that we can understand what Israel went through. That's the first thing. Then the second thing Israel did, the second piece of the Zionist drama that we've reiterated, is the rebellion against that. Zionism, the movement to return the Jewish people to its homeland, Zionism was a rebellion against the history of exile. It was a rebellion against that. We have to understand that rebellion because the energy of that rebellion is what's fueling Israel now. And then the third thing that happened in the history of Zionism, and has happened to us since October 7th, is an arrival in a place of realism, of understanding who we are, what kind of world we live in, what this is going to cost us, and how we're going to live. Now, if you're a Hegelian, you understand that's the great triangle of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The crisis of exile, the response of rebellion, and then an arrival at a sort of realism, a sanguine, bittersweet realism. That is what Israel is all about. And that's where we're coming to right now. That's what I want to talk about today. Then with Rachel and with Dani, we're going to get to feel that crisis, and we're going to see what the response was through poetry and music. Then we're going to come back and talk about what's coming, because what's coming is an argument. No surprise there. Jews respond to catastrophe by fighting with each other, at least in my family, right? And we got to understand what the terms of that argument are going to be, because that's also a reiteration of Zionist history. Now, unfortunately, here's a funny thing. Those of us, we love Israel, but not a lot of Jews have ever gone back and read all the stuff. So I'm going to bring you some texts from the history of the Zionist movement that I think you're going to find very eye-opening in terms of understanding where we are now and what's been happening in Israel now. And that's what we're going to start today. Okay? Any questions to get started with? Those of you who know me know that I have the teaching style, the pedagogic strategy of Benito Mussolini. So if you want to ask a question, get some clarification. If I use a word in a language you don't understand, because I don't speak any language particularly well, but it's a combination of Yiddish, Hebrew, and English. All right, so if there's any word that's not real clear, raise your hand, throw a shoe. Or anybody got a question, comment, counter sermon to start with? This isn't a Shabbos morning. You don't have to be respectful. Okay? Okay. All right, ready? In the year 64 BCE, the Roman government came and engaged and came and took over Jerusalem. They didn't really conquer Jerusalem. There's a civil war between two Maccabee brothers, and the Romans came in to bring peace, and they stayed. They never left. And Palestine became a Roman, Palestine meaning Israel, it's called Judea at the time, became a Roman province, very wealthy Roman province. So the Romans would set governors. And the governors were not particularly adept. They were people that bribed the emperor to get that job because it was a very lucrative job. And each Roman governor was more inept than the next. And so by the year 67, the Jerusalem population had had enough. And they rebelled. They rebelled against the Romans. This freaked out the Romans because, first of all, Judea was a very powerful and wealthy province, and the Romans couldn't afford to lose it. Number two, because the Persian Empire, called the Parthian Empire, was to the east of Israel, of Palestine, of Judea. And if Palestine became independent, the Parthians could enter and take over the whole eastern end of the Mediterranean. And the third reason was that if the Judeans showed people that Rome was vulnerable, then all the other provinces would rebel as well. So the Romans needed to quell this rebellion. They took their best general, a bullfighter from Spain named Vespasian, and their best army, the 10th Legion, moved them out of France, put them on boats, floated them to Lebanon, to Phoenicia, landed in Phoenicia, marched down the coast, burning, pillaging, murdering, what Romans do, right? Turned left, went up the hill, and sieged the city of Jerusalem. Siege was a form of ancient warfare. What you do is you surround a city and starve it to death, and eventually you invade. They besieged the city of Jerusalem. While the city was starving, there was a fight going on within the city. The guys who had started this rebellion were a sect of Jews called Zealots. And the Zealots believed that owning and controlling Jerusalem was the most important thing you could do for God. But not everybody agreed with that. And the people who disagreed most vehemently were the Pharisees, later to become the rabbis, later to become, well, us. And the Pharisees said, we can live under any government as long as we can learn Torah, practice Torah, and live Torah. We don't need, a flag. And it turned out that the head of the Zealots was the nephew of the head of the rabbis. It's one mishpacha, after all. And when it looked just horrifying in the city, here's the story. It's in Talmud Gittin. Here's the story, right? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the leader of the Pharisees, the leader of the rabbinic sect, went to his nephew, Abba Sikra is his name, and he said, let me get out of the city. Maybe I can do something. It was clear the Romans were going to flatten the city. They were going to kill as many as possible. Rabbi Yochanan wanted to save a remnant of this people. So Abba Sikra, who the guy had started the rebellion, was now sympathetic. He said, here's what you do. Pretend you're sick. Tell everybody you're sick. And then have them announce that you died. And then have your disciples take you out of the city. Because they would let dead bodies out of the city. You could get out through the siege lines, through the city with dead bodies. That was like respectful, right? So Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, the two great scholars that were his students, carried the beer. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was smuggled out of the city of Jerusalem just before the final battle began. And he went to the Romans. And he went to the Roman general. And he said to the Roman general, Shalom Aleichem, peace be unto you, O king, peace be unto you, O king. And I gave you a piece of the story. In the real story, the general says, what are you telling me, king? I'm a general. And just that moment, a messenger came from Rome and said, Mazel Tov, you have been elected emperor. The emperor died and you're the new emperor. The notables of Rome, the Roman Senate has elected you emperor. Now, anyone ever remember the first scene of the movie The Godfather? If you want to understand the Torah and Jewish history, you've got to know that movie. What happens in the first scene of The Godfather? Connie Corleone, the daughter of the Godfather's getting married. And on the day of the marriage of the Godfather's daughter, you can ask the Don for anything. So the baker wants his son-in-law to stay in America, right? So he says, call the Jewish senator and get him papers, right? And the undertaker wants justice for his daughter who was defiled, right? Remember that? And Frankie Valone wants the part in the movie. Make him an offer he can't refuse. Remember that? Well, the origin of that custom is this. On the day of the emperor's crowning, you can ask the emperor for anything, and he has to give it to you. So here stands Yochanan ben Zakkai in front of the newly crowned emperor of Rome, and he can ask for anything. Anything. What should he ask for? He should ask for the city. He should ask for his people. He should ask for the war to stop. He should offer terms. He should negotiate a peace with the emperor. He doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. And the Jewish community, the Jewish history for the last 2,000 years has tried to figure out, why the hell didn't he do that? Here's what happens. He says, Vespasian says to the rabbi, I'm now going. I'll send someone to take my place. You can make me a request and I'll grant it. Rabbi Yochanan said, give me Yavne and its scholars. Yavne is a small town down near Tel Aviv. Give me a town where I can build an academy. Give me a town where I can build a school. Give me my students. You can have the city. Even the Talmud at that moment stops and says, what? What? Rabbi Yosef, and Rabbi Akiva, who was his student, said, this is the verse, God turns wise men backwards and makes their knowledge foolish. Rabbi Akiva says, what, did he lose his mind? Did he lose his mind? He could have asked for the city. He could have asked for the temple. He could have asked for the land. He could have asked he could be made king of Judea, of Palestine. He asked for Yavne and the scholars. Why did he ask for Yavne and the scholars? Where does Judaism live? For the Zealots, Judaism lives in sovereignty on the land of Israel. For another group called the Sadducees, Judaism lives in the temple and its sacrifices. For the Essenes, which was the desert people, Judaism lived in their strange mystical rites. That's the Dead Sea sect. But for Rabbi Yochanan, where does Judaism live? It lives in Torah. It lives in Torah. Torah is where Judaism lives. We don't need a land. We don't need sovereignty. We don't need worldly power as long as we have the spiritual power given us by Torah. Given us by Torah. When you pray, which way do you turn? East. Why? What's in the east? Jerusalem. Okay? One exception to that. If you're in Jerusalem, you turn to the Temple Mount. That's true. What's the exception to that? Look behind me. If there is a Torah in the room, you turn toward the Torah, not toward Jerusalem. In other words, because for rabbinic Judaism, which was the extension of Pharisaic Judaism, Jerusalem is where your Torah is. Because the Torah now becomes the territory of the Jewish people. In other words, it wasn't just that the Romans conquered Palestine, destroyed the temple, exiled us from our land, and that's why we lived in exile for the last 2,000 years. We chose this. We chose it as a strategy. Rabbi Yochanan understood that if you attach yourself to a land, if you attach yourself to a government, to sovereignty, someone's going to come. If not the Romans, the next guys will come, and they'll conquer you. And when they conquer us, we'll be finished as a people. But if you attach yourself to Torah, you don't need worldly power. You don't need material power. You don't need political power. You don't need military power. It's good if you have it, but if you don't have it, we can manage. That strategy got us through 1,800 years of history. Because for 1,800 years, we backed out of history and said, that's for the Goyim. Let them kill each other. We're going to sit here and learn Torah. Right? That became the strategy. We accepted exile. We accepted exile as a strategy of survival. And we interpreted exile as a punishment. Look at the punishment. Look at the third source. This is a line in the Siddur. It's in your Siddur. I could share what page it's on. Mipnei chata'enu galinu me'artzenu. Because of our sins, we were exiled from our land, and therefore we can't fulfill all the commandments, particularly sacrifice. A more vivid one is this midrash in Avot Rabbi Nassan, right, which is a rabbinic source of the 4th century. When the temple was set afire, the chief priests who were in the temple took their keys in their hands. This is a beautiful image. They took their keys in their hand. They ran up to the roof of the temple. The temple's burning. They ran up to the roof and they tossed the keys into the heavens and exclaimed to God, Lord of the universe, here are your keys you entrusted us with. Since we have not been faithful custodians to carry out the duties set by the king, we are no longer worthy to eat at the king's table. Exile was, number one, a punishment for our sinfulness. Number two, it was a very clever strategy to survive history. If you're a small, peripheral, marginal people, how do you survive history? You leave. You back out of history. That's what exile is. But backing out of history carries a price. The price of backing out of history is the vulnerability. You can't defend yourself. That's the risk of exile. That's the difficulty of exile. Andy, please.
So why is it that those thoughts were irreconcilable? Meaning to say, why couldn't you marry using and living in Jerusalem with this philosophy that he had?
He did. And yeah, the question is why you can't marry the two ideas. The idea of Torah as the center of your life and in Jerusalem. Hang on to your hat. We're coming to that. In about 3 weeks. We're coming to that. That's called religious Zionism. That's where we're going to come to. But I want you to see exile has two faces. Exile was forced on us, and exile was chosen by us. Exile was forced on us, and it was chosen by us. There's a song taken from Maimonides' code of Jewish beliefs. We sing it at Yisker here at VBS. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema, I believe with perfect faith, beviat HaMashiach, in the coming of Messiah. Ve'af al pi sheyitmamea, even if it takes a long time, I still believe. In other words, what did we do? We took Israel, sovereignty, worldly power, rolled it into redemption, and put it into the future. Yes, we have a homeland in the future. We have a country in the future. We're waiting for God to bring redemption in the future. In the meantime, what is our job? Stay here in Encino. In the depths of poverty we live in Encino, right? Observe the Torah, believe in God, raise our families, keep the mitzvot, and someday God will come to here in Encino and bring us all together up to Eretz Yisrael. Messiah is going to come to Eretz Yisrael. And by the way, what if you don't live to see that? Not to worry, Messiah will raise the dead. So if you're buried at Eden or Mount Sinai or Hillside, not to worry, Messiah is going to stop by there, raise us all up, carry us all off to Israel. Don't be buried at Forest Lawn. He might not stop there. So here's what happens. Look in Talmud Ketuvot. Rav Yehuda taught, whoever goes up from Babylon to the land of Israel. So by that, Rav Yehuda is a fourth generation Amora. He lives in Babylon. The great diaspora community after the Romans destroyed the temple are in the east, in Babylon. Babylon's Iraq. It's along the Tigris and Euphrates. Big community, powerful community, right? He taught, stay here, don't go back to Israel. Why not? Here's why. He produces a midrash. It's based on two very obscure verses in the Song of Songs. I make you a promise, O maidens of Jerusalem, by gazelle or hinds of the field. Do not wake or rouse love until it pleases. Rav Yehuda taught his student, Rav Yossi, son of Rabbi Chanina, we made three promises. Promise number one, Israel promised, that's the Jewish people promised, not to go up to Israel altogether. We promised to wait for God to redeem us and not to have a political movement and return to Israel en masse. We promised that. Number two, that they not rebel against the nations of the world. We promised that wherever we live, we will observe the laws of the country in which we live. Dina de Malchuta Dina, says the Talmud. You observe the law of the country you live in. And in return, as long as that's the case, as long as you don't try to go up to Israel and hurry up the Messiah and jump the line, as long as you don't rebel against the nations you live in, God made the nations of the world promise not to oppress us too much. You know, anti-Semitism is hating Jews more than is absolutely necessary, right? Not to oppress us too much. A pogrom, yes. An auto da fe, okay. A forced conversion, maybe. An inquisition, but nothing more than that.
Can you say that again?
Nothing more than that. Nothing more than that. In other words, what did God promise? If you stay in exile and wait for my redemption, I will, and you stay out of history. You do not try to game the politics of the world and leave and get back into history. You wait where you are, and I will come get you one day. As long as you do that, I will keep history from hurting you. Get it? There is a sect of Jews in Brooklyn and in Jerusalem called Neturei Karta. And ironically, they're a Lithuanian movement that is anti-Hasidic movement. And they're now allies with the Satmar Hasidim, who are Hungarian Hasidim, who do not love the state of Israel. Why not? They are very, 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 very religious Jews. And they believe that the reason the Holocaust happened was because we violated this promise. We promised not to go up to Israel. You broke the promise. The end of the 19th, early 20th century, You started a political movement to go up to Israel. You started a political movement to move to Israel. God said, okay, you want to be back in history? I'll put you back in history. And history came and smashed us. And so for the Neturei Karta and for the Satmar, it's not an exaggeration to say that Herzl and Hitler are flip sides of one coin. Herzl, the architect of the Jewish return to history, and Hitler, the punishment that comes. It's not so much a punishment, it just means you're not being protected from the forces of history. You see? You see? You see how that works? Everybody see how that works? That was exile. We promised to stay here quietly in Tarzana, observe mitzvot, teach our children Torah, give a lot of money to Valley Beth Shalom, and wait for the Messiah to come and redeem us. And when the Messiah redeems us, then we can go back to Eretz Yisrael. Here's another text along the same direction. This is a very famous story, right? So the story in the Bible is God says to Moshe, come up to Mount Sinai, I'm going to give you the 10 Commandments, right? So the story, the Talmud story says, so what happens when Moses got to the top of the mountain? So Moses climbs to the top of Mount Sinai, and he sees God writing a Torah. Anyone ever seen a Torah scroll? I hope you've all seen a Torah scroll. If you ever noticed a Torah scroll, the calligraphy of a Torah scroll, certain letters have decorations, little crowns. They're called in Hebrew tagim. In Yiddish, they're called chupchikim, right? Little chmichikles, little decorations. So Moses is watching God calligraph a Torah, and he says to God, what are you doing that for? Why are you putting decorations into the calligraphy? Just put the words, right? And God says to him, generations from now, there shall live a man named Akiba ben Yosef, that's Rabbi Akiba, who will interpret a gigantic mountain of halacha, of law, from each one of these decorations. The decorations he'll interpret. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, I got to meet this guy. So God says, turn around. And all of a sudden, Moses is sitting in Rabbi Akiba's academy. And the joke is, he's sitting in the 8th row of Rabbi Akiba's academy. I know that doesn't land with you, so let me try to explain the joke. The first row is for the men who are about to be ordained rabbis. The second row are for the A+ students. The third row for the A-, B+ fellas. The fourth row for the B-, C+ fellas. Fifth, sixth, the guys whose fathers paid off the rabbi to have them there. 8th row is for the children who are barely literate. Moshe Rabbeinu is sitting in the back of Rabbi Akiba's academy, and he can't understand what's going on. Right? Now, it's like, what if Thomas Jefferson or James Madison entered the American Supreme Court today? Would he be able to understand what was going on? Right? Not just politically, but just in terms of the law being debated. I mean, so the founder of Torah, the author of Torah, can't understand the Torah that Rabbi Akiba is teaching. You see the game here? This is the rabbis winking at us, telling us, we know that we have taken the Judaism Moses started with and expanded it very, very far beyond anything Moses could have understood. Right? It's okay, Shirley. We need a musical break. And now a musical interlude. This is great. It's okay. It's okay. Answer. Maybe there's something important. Maybe it's Moshe Rabbeinu. He's trying to get into the shul. One of the students, and Moses is very upset because he can't understand the discussion, so he thinks that this generation has abandoned his Torah. Until one of the students asks Rabbi Akiba, how do you know that law? And Akiba responds, Halacha l'Moshe miSinai. It's a law that God gave Moses on Mount Sinai. And Moses hears his name and talk of Mount Sinai, and he says, good. Now I know that this is the extension of what I brought. So he goes back up to heaven, and he says to God, you had a guy like Akiba, and you gave the Torah through a guy like me, a schnook like me? And God says, shtok, which is literally shut up. Kacha chazar. This is what I have decided. This is what I have decreed. That's part one of the story. Everybody got it? Charming, right? Part two is not so charming. Part two, Rabbi Moshe says to God, show me this man's reward. If that's his Torah, God, what kind of reward must be, what kind of life must he be living? And you know the story is that Rabbi Akiva was martyred to death by the Romans in public, and his body was hung in the marketplace. So Moshe turns around, and there's the body of the martyred Akiva hanging in the marketplace of Jerusalem. And Moshe is devastated. And he goes back to God, and he says, Zo Torah v'zo schara. This is the man's Torah, and this is the reward you gave him? Like, what kind of universe are you running? The hell is wrong with you? How could a scholar, a man whose being was effused with Torah, have an end like this? And God says the same words, Shtok kach gazarti. Be quiet, this is my decree. Now this is don't turn a page yet. This is exile. In exile, what is exile? What did the Jewish people promise? What did we make a decision to do? We will live our lives in Torah. And in the realm of Torah, in the realm of private religion, in the privacy of our communities, in our homes, our synagogues, our communities, we will have tremendous power to create religious life. But once we step out of that community into the world of history, into the world of power and politics, we resign. God runs that world. We reign in the world of Torah. God reigns in the world of politics. So why was it that if every Yom Kippur we end the fast by saying, L'shana haba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, and every Pesach Seder ends with the words, L'shana haba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, why didn't we go back? Because of this. Because, first of all, Israel, Jerusalem, stopped being a place, and it started being a dream. Israel was not a place, a geography, a territory, a land. It became a dream of a redeemed world that will come when God is good and ready to bring it. Our job is to wait patiently. Afal pisha yismamea. Wait patiently until God decides and brings us back to Israel and redeems the world around us. That was the Jewish dream. And truth be told, it worked. We survived from 70 CE, when the temple was destroyed, with this attitude about exile until the middle of the 19th century. And exile, the virtue of exile was it gave us a way to survive a really rough history. It gave us the wherewithal as a community to survive. It gave us the capacity to conceive of ourselves without losing our minds. Anyone ever been to Ireland? I recommend you go. It's a wonderful, beautiful country, right? Wonderful beer, and booze, and music, and culture. But some really interesting thing about Ireland. I went to Ireland, Nina and I went to Ireland, and you talk to Irish people, they have no self-respect. It's the strangest thing. They say, well, whatever Ireland's doing well, we'll screw it up. We were there during a time when there was a boom because Ireland was a tax-free zone and a lot of trade was going through Ireland. And our tour guide was a 29-year-old history student from Trinity University. He said, we'll screw it up. We always screw it up. All the statues are to dead martyrs who tried to make Ireland. Ireland was conquered by everybody. It was conquered by the Vikings. It was conquered by the Visigoths. It was conquered by the Romans. It was conquered and then ultimately by the British, who really just raped the country. And the Irish lived in their land but lost their self-respect. I'll give you another story. Same story. My daughter is a psychologist. She lives in Arizona. She is working in a clinic. It's the biggest mental health clinic in Arizona. They have a contract with the Navajo Nation. They provide mental health services, Navajo Nation. My daughter happens to have two expertise. She had two fellowships that she was training. One was in chemical and alcohol dependence, and the other is in domestic violence, trauma. Guess what the Navajo Nation suffers from worst? How many is it? 150 years since the Navajos were conquered by gringos, right? And they're still suffering. They live on their own land, but they suffer. How come we didn't? How come we survived 1,800 years of exile and never lost hope, never lost dignity, never lost our community structure, never became dependent on alcohol, never engaged in domestic violence? I mean, there's domestic violence in the Jewish community, don't get me wrong, but it was never the epidemic it is in certain other communities. Why not? I'm not blaming the Irish. The Irish earned it. They got conquered by everybody. The Navajos certainly got conquered by everybody. We got conquered. We didn't lose our hope because this idea of exile protected us. Yes, but it also made us vulnerable. It made us vulnerable, first of all, externally, because we became the victims of pogroms, riots, destruction over and over and over again. Right? Over and over again. And we didn't fight back. We didn't fight back. Right? We accepted the violence that came our way. And then the second vulnerability was that. What happens to a community that doesn't fight back? In the middle of the 19th century, something broke. Something broke within the Jewish heart, both Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Something broke. The patience ran dry. Now, part of it was our emancipation and the invitation of European cultures to enter European culture. And in European culture in the mid-19th century, you had a rise of romantic nationalisms. Italy was united into a country. Germany was united into a country. France, the Czech Republic, Slovaks, Russians, everyone was flying flags, singing songs, talking about national culture, motherland, fatherland, blood and guts and soil. Nationalism became the watchword of the mid-19th century. We absorbed that. A second thing that happened was Jews started leaving the ghetto in Western Europe and even a little bit in Eastern Europe and looking and saying, wait a minute, Beethoven? Why don't we have a Beethoven? Rembrandt? Why don't we have a Rembrandt? Right? Where are great artistic, scientific, what happened to us? There was a sudden sense of that something has broken within the Jewish spirit. But most of all, it came from the violence of Eastern European pogroms. The violence of Eastern European pogroms and the violence of Western European anti-Semitism. This is a very famous source, the story of Theodor Herzl. Some of you did this with me before, so I apologize. Theodor Herzl was born in Budapest in 1860. When he was 18, his sister died of tuberculosis, so the family moved to Vienna. And he went to the University of Vienna and studied law and didn't want to practice law. He was a writer, not a good one, but a writer. And he started writing. There was a liberal newspaper called the New Free Press, and he started writing for them. He wrote political pieces. He wrote he loved cultural pieces, much more political pieces. He wrote bad plays. He was Jewish, didn't know very much about Judaism, but knew he was Jewish because if you were Jewish in Vienna in the 19th century, they told you were Jewish, right? He had gotten thrown out of his fraternity in college because he stood up for the Jews. And then he did one interesting thing happened to him. He got married to a very wealthy girl who happened to be a ferocious schizophrenic. And her parents were so glad to get rid of her, so glad to have her married, that the family took the couple on a honeymoon, on a 6-month honeymoon to all of the great spas of Central Europe, right? Baden-Baden and all these famous bads. And everywhere Herzl went, he wrote a travel piece on the joy of this spa. How beautiful it was, how good the meals were, what the entertainment was like, the environment was like. And these were being published in the New Free Press of Vienna. And he got a huge reputation as being this one. People wanted to read him, right? They wanted to read him. So when he got back to Vienna, he was already an accomplished writer. So the people in Vienna decided to do a great thing. They'll send him to Paris. And all he has to do is sit in cafes and write opera reviews. Not a job I wouldn't mind, right? And to get away from his wife, so he goes to Paris, and he gets to Paris just in time for the Dreyfus trial. Alfred Dreyfus, a Jew from Alsace-Lorraine, assimilated Jew, was the only Jew accepted to the École Militaire, to the French National Military Academy, graduates, become a captain in a French army, and is accused of being a traitor to France when France loses a war. Why did France lose a war? Because they were French. That's what they do. But they had to blame somebody. They blamed the Jew. And the story that Herzl tells in his autobiography, although it's been disputed by historians, but Herzl was a great storyteller, is that he was standing in the crowd as they were, if you watch the movie with Frederick March, it's a good movie, they're tearing the epaulets off Dreyfus's uniform and tearing off his buttons, and they break his sword and they slap him across the face and they brand him a traitor, and the crowd there is screaming, not death to the traitor, not death to the enemy, not even Vive la France. They're shouting what? Yeah, and what did Herzl realize? That even in the most liberal society in Europe, remember, Jews had been liberated, Jews had been emancipated in France in 1789 with the revolution. And then that was validated by Napoleon in 1804, right? Jews had been equals, legal equals for almost a century. And what happened? There was still vicious anti-Semitism. Herzl realized something. This is what he realized. In medieval societies, they would attack the Jews. Why did they attack the Jews? Well, for two principal reasons. One is because we killed their Lord, and they had to get back at us, so Easter was the worst time for Jews. And two, because they owed us money. They couldn't lend money. We lent money to Europeans, and they owed us money, and if you don't want to pay back your debts, the best thing to do is kill the banker, right? So, but as long as those were the two reasons they hated Jews, we were okay. You know why? Because they could never completely kill us all. Number one, they would lose their banks. And number two, they would lose the figure of the Christ killer that they needed to show that's what happens if you don't accept Christ. Get it? Everybody got that? So anti-Semitism was vicious, but not total. Herzl realized that was no longer the case. That now anti-Semitism was no longer religious and it was no longer economic. It was national. If I'm French and you're not, then I'm going to kill you, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't convert to become French. You can't make an excuse. Herzl began to see Auschwitz in his nightmares. He saw that Europeans now hated Jews in a different way and would one day engineer a final solution to the Jewish problem. And so he sits down and in a manic fit begins to write a short little book called The Jewish State. And this is an excerpt from that book. He says, "We are a people, one people." Now that's controversial. Why is that controversial? Because the first person he brought this book to was Baron Rothschild, the richest Jew in Europe, who had a palace in Paris. And he knocked on the door and he gave the butler his business card. Now his business card said Theodor Herzl, New Free Press of Vienna. And he was a well-known writer. It's like Tom Friedman knocking at your door, Bret Stephens knocking at your door, right? You get the picture, right? If David Brooks knocks on your door, you're going to answer the door, right? So Rothschild comes down. Herzl hands him the book. What is Rothschild? When Rothschild self-identifies, how does he identify? I am what? I am wealthy, I am French, and I am... No, not Jewish. That's no, because he's French, you see. Only in America do we have hyphenated identities. In France, you're either French or you're Jewish. You can't be both. In America, you can be a Jewish American, Italian American, Irish American, right? But not in Europe, you're French. So I'm a French person of the Mosaic persuasion, of the Mosaic faith, right? Herzl comes along and says, nonsense. We are a people. We're not French. We're not German. We're not Italian. We're not English, right? We're not Czech. We're not Russian. We tried. We really did. But we're a people, one people. We have honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities and preserve the faith of our fathers. We tried. For a century, we have tried to become French and English and German and Italian. And you know what we did? We did it better than them. We spoke better English than English people, better French than French people. We ate French, talked French, dressed French, were French in every way. But you know what? In vain. We are not permitted to do so. In vain are we loyal patriots, our loyalty in some places running to extremes. In vain do we make the same sacrifice of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to increase the fame of our native lands, etc. Right? In countries where we have lived for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers. And often by those whose ancestors were not yet here when Jews had already begun suffering here. The majority decide who are the strangers, because in every point of life that arises between nations, it's a question of might. And he says, I don't surrender any of my argument on what's right, but I notice this, in the world as it is now, might precedes right. In other words, we can argue and argue and argue and argue and tell them that they're wrong and that anti-Semitism is irrational and wrong. Does this sound familiar to anyone? It ain't going to help. You know why? Because they just hate us. And there's nothing we can do about it. And this is what he says, right? It is useless for us to be loyal patriots. If we could only be left in peace, I think we shall not be left in peace. That's an understatement. He thought it would start in France, by the way, not Germany. Can we hope for better days? Can we possess our souls in patience? Can we wait in pious resignation till the princes and people of the earth are more mercifully disposed toward us? I say we cannot. The nations in whose midst Jews live are either overtly or covertly anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism is so deeply rooted in Western culture, it will never be rooted out. So you're either going to have to figure out how to live with it or die by it. Those are the two choices. And Herzl says the only thing we can do is get out of here. What happens is that the old idea of Torah as the core of our lives, of Yavneh, not the temple, the old idea of stepping out of history and not being part of history, Herzl says that idea has run its course. If we do not take power now, material power, political power, military power, they'll kill us all. They will kill us all. And nothing will hold them back. No Christianity, no capitalism, nothing, and no conscience. No conscience. Nothing will hold us back. This is a cry of pain. Can you hear the cry in this? But it is also a realistic vision of the world in which Herzl lived. Now, he didn't know about America, by the way. So liberal democracies like America, he didn't understand. He had no idea who we were, except for one tiny thing. Notice, he needs a land, and he needs power, the power that comes with being a government, a state. Where that land is not necessarily Israel. Israel has the advantage of being something we have deep feelings for. But you know what? Right now, the main thing is get Jews out of Europe. So he considered 5 different places. Israel was number 1. Uganda was number 2. It was actually East Kenya, right? Azerbaijan was number 3. Okay? Madagascar was number 4. And number 5 was Arizona. No, Arizona. Because in 1896, Arizona was a territory. It wasn't a state. It was sparsely populated. The American government was trying to bring immigrants there. I think that had been just great. I'm sorry. I love Israel. I pray at the Kotel. But if you can put the London Bridge in Lake Havasu, you could put the Kotel in Tucson. And I think making Aliyah on Southwest Airlines would have been a kick. It's a hell of a lot easier to get to Phoenix than it is to get to Tel Aviv these days. And if we have to fight some crazy people, let it be the Navajo Liberation Organization, not the Palestine. I think Arizona would have been just keen. I mean, just think of that, right? All right, but I want you to hear this. So we start out, let's recap. We start out with exile. An exile that is both self-chosen, but an exile which is a recognition that we're going to live a vulnerable life. Most of us have no notion of this, right? Most of us have grown up, I've grown up, I'll speak for myself, I've grown up in a world where I know that if I call 911, more or less the cops might come, right? The fire department will come. I've never lived in a society where the police department was part of the problem, was trying to kill me, right? That's Germany in 1937, right? Never lived in, sorry? No, you're exactly right. But absolutely, I live privileged beyond, but within the Jewish context, but exile means living a powerless life, and the only power you hold on to is spiritual power, not material power. And therefore, you are utterly vulnerable. Utterly vulnerable. There's no one who's going to protect you, and there's nobody out there who's going to take care of you. And what comes with that is, number one, this kind of helplessness that he's talking about. We can never be accepted. We will never be protected. Zionism comes as a rebellion against that idea of exile. It was a rebellion against it. It's hard to imagine, because today, if you stand up in a synagogue and say you don't believe in God, you don't think the Torah is true, you don't think rabbis speak the truth, the worst thing that can happen is the lady behind you is going to ask you to move aside. She'd like to see the bar mitzvah. If you stand up in a Jewish synagogue, most synagogues, not all now, but most, and declare that Israel should not be a Jewish state, they'll hit you to death with your pocketbooks before you reach the exit. Zionism has become the core of part of the core of our Jewish identity, and rightly should. But once upon a time, it was the antithesis. That's the next story. Chaim Chazaz is an Israeli novelist, okay? And he came to Israel as a kid. And this is a famous story that he wrote, and you'll see the date, 1943. The context is, there's not much of a story, it's really the sermon. There's a kibbutz meeting. My parents were kibbutzniks, so I know what this means. Once a week, there was a kibbutz meeting. And the kibbutz meeting started out with simple practical things. Who's on kitchen duty? A window got broken in the children's house, we have to get it fixed. Things like this. And then as they get into the night, they discuss ideology, philosophy. So there's a little kibbutznik, and his name is Yudke. It's an interesting name. It's Yehuda, which means Jew, but it's the Russian diminutive of Yehuda, Yudke. And he's a little guy. And he's not a macher. He's not one of the leaders of the kibbutz. He's just a schlepper. And he stands up at the kibbutz meeting and says, I would like to say something. And they say, Yudke, we have important business to conduct. He says, okay, but when you're ready, I have something I want to say. So the night goes on, and late into the night, they finally turn to him, and he won't go away, and he says, here's what I want to say. And this is the speech. Listen, just listen to this. I want to say that I am opposed to Jewish history. I want to begin with the fact that we have no history at all. That's a fact, because we didn't make our own history. The Goyim made it for us. Just as they used to put out our candles on Shabbat, milk our cows, and light our ovens on Shabbat. Sabbath, you can't do these things, so you hire the non-Jew next door. So they made our history for us to suit themselves, and we took it from them as it came. They forced it on us, whether we liked it or not. Besides, what's in Jewish history, he says? Oppression, defamation, persecution, martyrdom, and again, oppression, defamation, persecution, martyrdom, again and again and again without end. That's what's in it. Nothing more. After all, it bores you to death. It's just dull. Here now, in Palestine, our children love to read, unless they're stupid. I know this for a fact. I've looked into it. Yes, they read, but historical novels about Goyim, not about Jews. Why is it? It's no accident. It's simply because Jewish history is dull. It's uninteresting. It has no glory or action, no heroes or conquerors, no rulers and masters of their fate, just a collection of wounded, hunted, groaning, wailing wretches, always begging for mercy. I would simply forbid teaching our children Jewish history. Why the devil teach them about their ancestors' shame? I would say to them, boys, From the day we were driven out from our land, we've been a people without history. Class dismissed. Go outside and play football. Listen to that sentence again. This is profound. This is the rebellion against exile. Do you hear it? This is the rebellion against that strategy that Yochanan ben Zakkai authored. And the rebellion is there because, yes, it got us through 100 years of history. And yes, it put Torah at the center, but it made us less than fully human because we gave up the power of creating the conditions of our own existence. It diminished us. It diminished us as human beings to be that powerless. Boy, he says, why? I simply forbid teaching our children Jewish history. Why the devil teach them their ancestors' shame? I would simply say to them, boys, from the day we were driven out of our land, we've been a people without history. Class dismissed, go out and play football. In other words, Jewish history has 3 periods, right? The time we lived in the land and had power, all that other stuff, and the time we came back to the land, which, by the way, is classic Zionist education. Up until very recently, that's how Israeli schools were taught. Kids learned the Bible, and then they learned Herzl. Everything in between is irrelevant. Why? Because it's the story of powerlessness. And powerlessness is shameful. Powerlessness was shameful. Shameful. You live that way? You let them do that to you? You made yourself a victim on purpose? What the hell is wrong with you? That's what Zionism. It was a rebellion against the helplessness. Because the helplessness of exile became too much to bear. Too much to bear. Right? I know that there's heroism in the way we stood up to all that oppression and suffering, he says. I take it into account. But it's nothing but the heroism of despair. What a phrase. With no way out, anyone can be a hero. Whether he wants it or not, he must be. And there's no credit or honor in that. In the second place, this heroism, after all, amounts to great weakness, worse than weakness, a special kind of talent for corruption and decay. That's how it is. The type of hero sooner or later begins to pride himself on his heroism and brags about it. See what great torments I withstood? See what untold shame and humiliation I suffered? Who can compare with me? See, we don't merely suffer torments. It's more than that. We love these torments. That's a hell of an indictment of the Jewish people, right? I mean, just think of what he's saying here. We love torments for their own sake. We want to be tortured. We're eager for it. We yearn for it, right? To my mind, if I'm right, now listen to this now. Ready? Hold on to your hat. Literally. If I'm right, Zionism and Judaism are not the same, but 2 things quite different from each other, and maybe even 2 things directly opposite each other. At any rate, far from the same. When a person can no longer be a Jew, he becomes a Zionist. Zionism begins with the wreckage of Judaism. From the point where the strength of the people fails. That's a fact. Nobody has yet begun to understand Zionism. It is far deeper, far more pregnant with the vast and fateful consequence that appears on the surface, or so people say. What do you think? Pretty amazing, huh? So stage 1 of this process was the exile that we endured for 1,800 years. Stage 2 was beginning in the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century. There is a rebellion against that. A rebellion both in Eastern and Western Europe that says, enough waiting. We're not going to wait anymore. We're not going to suffer these torments anymore. We're not going to celebrate martyrdom anymore. We're going to stand up and create the conditions of our own existence. We will do it ourselves. We will not wait for God. Great song. You all know this song. You never read the song in this context. One of the things that the Zionists did was they wanted heroes. But there are not a lot of heroes in Jewish history. Like, who are you going to be a hero? But not a hero for a person who suffered, not that kind of hero, not a martyr. Rabbi Akiva's a martyr. That's why he's a hero. So they went looking for heroes. one of the great heroes. What was the last war a Jewish army won before 1948? The Maccabees. So the Zionists make Hanukkah a big holiday. It never was a big holiday. Even when Macy's got hold of it, it wasn't a big holiday. Even in America, it wasn't a big. It was Israel that made. Why? Because they wanted strong, tough, bad Jews. Good Jews, but strong Jews. Self-reliant Jews. Powerful Jews. Jews who don't let the world push them around. Right? So we have a Hanukkah song. You all know this Hanukkah song, right? It's interesting because the bracha we say, She'asa nisim lavaseinu bayamim hahem bazman hazeh, God who made miracles at this time of year, and we talk about lights and stuff, right? Then we sing Maus Sur. It's another interesting song. Then we sing this song. In my house, we sing this song. Mi yimalel gvurot Yisrael otan, mi yimne hein bechol dor yakum magibor goel ha'am. Shema bayamim hahem bazman hazeh Maccabi Moshiach ufodeh uvyamenu kolam Yisrael yitached yakum vayigael. Okay, now, not a medieval tune, not a rabbinic tune, written actually in about 1945, 1950. Written not too unreasonable. Written by a guy named Menashe Rabinowitz, who actually studied music in New York. He was from Russia, studied music in New York, makes Aliyah to Israel, changed his name to Menashe Ravina. I love that. Right? And writes this song. And if you read it, he's a yeshiva guy, so he knows. Let's read it. It's so interesting. Ready? First line. Mi yimalel gvurot Yisrael otan mi yimneh. Who can retell the mighty deeds of Israel? Who can count them? In the book of Psalms, in the Bible, I gave it to you at the bottom here, Psalm 106, verse 2, Mi yimalel gvurot Adonai. Who can retell the mighty acts of God? But he changes it to Mi yimalel gvurot. Come on, God, help me here. Mi yimalel gvurot Yisrael. We're not waiting for God's miracles. We're going to make miracles. Otan mi yimneh hen bechol dor, in every generation, yakum hagibor goel ha'am. Okay? In the prayer book, you can open up and look. Right after Michamocha is this verse from Isaiah. Jacob was saved and rescued from a power mightier than he. Baruch atah Adonai goel Yisrael. God who is the Redeemer of Israel. Ravina rewrites that in Hein bechol dor, in every generation, Yakum hagibor goel ha'am. Who is the goel ha'am? Who is the rescuer, the Redeemer of Israel? No longer is it God, now it's the Gibor, the hero. The man of war. The mighty hero. Right? And then we get the verse. You ready for the verse? Shema! Does that sound familiar to anyone? What's supposed to come next? Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. No. Bayamim hahem bazman hazeh. That sounds like the bracha we said over the candles, right? Right? Baruch atah bayamim hahem. That's the same. Maccabee, Moshiach ufodeh. Moshiach means a savior, it's a rescue. Fodeh means to rescue. God isn't going to rescue you. Maccabees rescued us. Bayamim hahem bazman hazeh. That's the bracha, but not God doing miracles. Maccabee Moshiach ufodeh. And now comes you think that was radical? Here comes the most radical part. Uvyamenu kolam Yisrael, and in our day, let all of Israel, 3 verbs now. Yitached, from the word echad. The word echad means one. Yitached means to unify. From the word Shema Yisrael, Adonai echad, but not Adonai echad anymore. Now it's going to be Israel Yitached, will unify itself. Yakum rise up, and here's the most radical word, Yigael, redeem itself. Hanukkah is a holiday of God redeeming us? No, no more. Not anymore. We're going to redeem ourselves. The Zionist project was a rebellion against the helplessness of exile. By the middle of the 19th century, Jews got tired of waiting for God's Messiah, and they decided to take history back into their own hands. They decided to jump back into history. They rejected the weakness. They interpreted it as weakness and impotence and the diminished disrespect of living as victims and martyrs, and stood up and said, we will take back the land, we will take back history, we will control our own existence. Okay? Sound familiar? On October 7th, we tasted the helplessness of exile. And October 8th, we decided we ain't standing for this. And what's come since then has been motivated by this. We will not be shoved into a corner and made martyrs again, no more. And the brutality of it, when we can argue whether the brutality, how moral and how immoral the brutality of it is, but the brutality is fueled by these sentiments, these very deep sentiments, right? Usually when Israel went to war, they call up reserves. You know, most of Israel's military is not a standing army. It's a reserve army, right? Most of the time, when they call up reserves for a battle, when they're not just a normal rotation, but a battle, they would get 80% of the reserves to come and serve. The other 20%, guys, they had excuses. You know, my wife had a new baby, I have a new job, I live in America. After October 7th, you know what the number was? 130%. That is, more reservists came to Israel to join their units than they had equipment for. That's why they were wanting an equipment, because they have equipment for 80 to 90% of the unit. They didn't have equipment for 180, 130%. The kid here, David Berger, was in Shul Shabbos. The kid who is here. He was living here. He got on a plane and he went to Israel. And he walked into the base and said, I'm here. You know, there's a story, one of the great stories was they crowded at El Al in LA, and the stewardess went to the pilot and said, we have no more seats. So he said, let him sit on the floor. So it violated every FAA rule there is. But he wasn't going to say no to a group of men who wanted to go back. And every one of them went back for what purpose? For my people, for my land, for my family. That's this rebellion. That's this rebellion. That's what you hear here. That was stage 2 in the development of Zionism. The rebellion against the helplessness of exile, and this passionate desire to remake the image of the Jew, to remake the identity of the Jew, and to rewrite Jewish history. Right? Right? What Chazaz writes here is really prophetic in some ways, right? Zionism and Judaism are not the same. For him, Judaism is the helplessness, the martyrdom, the diminishment of the exile, of Galut. Zionism is when you stand up and say, I'm a human being, I'm going to defend my family. Right? And that's the drama of this thing. That's the drama of this thing. There's only one problem. There's only one problem. What's the problem? When you jump back into history, that also carries a price tag. Right? That also carries a price tag. And the question then is, how do you live with that? I mean, this kind of Maccabee waving of the flag and pounding your fists and rattling the swords, that's great. But what's the price of that? Ultimately, what's the price of that? And how do you live both of these truths? The one which is a truth of a people that understands the flow of history and spent 2,000 years developing an ethic of how to live in history as a sacred people, and the strength of standing up and saying, I want to control the conditions of my own existence. How do you reconcile those two? That's what Israel is all about. And that's what's going on right now in Israel. Right? How many Palestinians are you going to kill before you say enough is enough? If you can't get back the hostages, if you can get back the hostages, if you don't get Sinwar, if you do get this, and then how many guys have to die in these wars? Every day, it's another 2-3 guys, right? So Natan Alterman is one of the poet laureates of Israel, one of the original poet laureates of Israel, and one of the great, most perceptive voices. And this is one of the most classic poems of Israeli literature. Okay? It's based on a statement made by Chaim Weizmann, and you see the date. Chaim Weizmann gave an interview, or a speech rather, that was reported in Haaretz. Chaim Weizmann was the first president of Israel. He was a leader of the Zionist movement worldwide, and then became the first president of Israel. He's a British scientist. He's a very distinguished British scientist. And he gave a speech that was reported in Haaretz on December 15th, 1947, and he makes the statement, the state, that is the state of Israel, will not be given to the Jewish people on a silver platter. Right? Now, look at the date. Anybody recognize that date? November 29th, 1947 is the date that the United Nations votes on the partition of Palestine. The British announced that in 6 months, right, in May of 1948, they're going to leave, and Ben-Gurion decides he's going to announce the state in May of 1948. This is a month after, not even 3 weeks after the United Nations vote. And Weizmann says, we need a state. We're going to establish a state, but let's not kid ourselves. You don't get a state on a silver platter. And Alterman, who's a refugee from Europe, understands this. And he writes this poem. It's a brutal poem, I got to tell you. But you'll appreciate what's going on in Israel now if you read this poem. He writes this poem and he publishes it in the same newspaper in Haaretz 4 days later. 4 days later. Okay? Now here's the poem. You ready? As the nation stands up, torn at heart, but existing, to receive its first wonder in 2,000 years. As the moment draws near, it will rise, darkness facing, standing straight in the moonlight, in terror and joy. He's looking forward to that day when the state will be declared, only a few months from now, right? When across from it, step out toward it, it is the state, is the community, us, slowly pacing in plain sight of all, a young girl and a boy, dressed in battle gear, dirty, shoes heavy with grime. On the path they will climb up while their lips remain sealed. To change garb, to wipe brow, they have not yet found time. Still bone weary from days and from nights in the field, full of endless fatigue and all drained of emotion, yet the dew of their youth is still seen in their head. Thus, like statues, they stand stiff and still with no motion, with no sign that will show if they live or are dead. Then a nation in tears, and amazed at this matter, will ask, who are you? And the two will then say with a soft voice, we are the silver platter. We are the silver platter on which the Jews' state was presented today. Then they fall back in the darkness and day's nation looks, and the rest can be found in the history books. And the land will grow still, crimson skies dimming, misting, slowly paling again over smoking frontiers. That's the synthesis. You hear the synthesis? So the thesis is exile, which got us through 1,800 years of brutal history And we survived as a coherent culture and community. And the antithesis comes as a rebellion against that in the mid-19th century, which says it's time to take back history. Take back history. We will become the heroes of our history. We will conduct our history. We will shape our history. And that means taking back power, returning to power. We will become a people of power. And we will have the dignity of being a people of power that can defend ourselves. No longer worshiping martyrdom. Martyrdom is no longer to be a category to be revered. From now on, heroism will be revered. That's the antithesis. And the synthesis is yes, but don't kid yourself. There's a price to be paid. There's a price to be paid for entering history again. There's a price to be paid for making yourself visible and vulnerable to the forces of history again. There's a price to be paid, and the price is often paid by the children of a community, by the young people. Don't kid yourself. It's not all flags and glory and victory. It's a lot of tears and a lot of pain. And that gives you a sense of the depth of what happened on October 7th, and then October 8th, and now these last 150 days. This is really what is being reiterated in the life of Israel now. Those three movements: the helplessness, the rising up to fight back and push back, and then the recognition of, how do you live in a world like this? How do you live in a world? How do you make sense of any of this? And if you push away God and say, I want no more God in my life because I want to be the hero, how do you make any sense of this? How do you make any sense of this? How do you find a sense of purpose in all of this? And that's the great story of Zionism, and that's what we have just lived through these last 150 days. Now, the next thing we're going to do is take a look at how Israelis interpret this. This is from this is my reconstruction of the Zionist past. Now we'll take a look at how Israelis look at this, and we'll look at through poetry and literature, and then through song, and then through political life in Israel. Those are going to be our next three sort of examinations, okay?